Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for standing by. Here's our passage for this morning, Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. When I read these, I'd like to observe that I've just learned something that Jeff Gang probably has known for a long time, and that is, it's not altogether certain that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hung and died within a few minutes from that experience. It seems possible, or more than possible, that he was cut down before he totally suffocated, then tortured and rehung. That was the standard practice in that setting by those people. And that could have happened repeatedly. So we have been given a picture of Dietrich Bonhoeffer going to the gallows and kneeling and praying and with not much struggle, dying. But it's possible that that's a sanitized version of the story. Jeff could talk to us about that later. But when I thought about that, I thought of this passage in Revelation chapter 6. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. Let me try again. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth? They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number would be complete, both of their fellow servants and of their brothers and sisters, who were soon to be killed, as they themselves had been killed. I'm having a tough time. I did not know. I did not know that this is how Bonhoeffer might have died. Jeff, am I totally wrong on this?
Dave, I mean, I don't know if we actually know definitively how exactly he died. I think that there's a lot of different there's a lot of speculation, and that certainly could have been the case. We do know that he was likely tortured often, especially when he was in Tegel prison, and when he was going through interrogations. And we know that he spent time in Tegel. He spent time in Buchenwalde, and then eventually he was transferred in the dark of night to Flossenburg on the Czech border, and he was there with a group of people, and they came and got him, and that was the last anyone saw of him. So no one definitively knows exactly how he died, but you're right that the Nazis, the SS in particular, who he was in the hands of the SS, they were notorious for torturing their victims, and in unspeakable ways.
And I read that the man who gave us this picture of him kneeling and so sweetly dying, if that can be done, I read that he may well have sanitized the story for his own self-interest, because he himself had been involved in torturing people in the past, and he wanted to give out a story that would not implicate him.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have not heard that before, so I'd be curious if you have a link or resource to that. I'd be like to check it out. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now I need to know where I read that. Okay, let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this day. Thank you for these people, and thank you for Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, over to you, Jeff. Thank you so much for staying by.
Hey, no worries.
I apologize for this rough start.
Hey, it happens. Trust me. If you teach online enough, you experience these types of things, and you just have to roll with it. So, nice to see everyone again. I hope that you're doing well. It's been a few months since I had a chance to come and spend some time with you. So yeah, it's good to be back and talk about this person that's been so instrumental in my life and formational and I continues to challenge me, a person who continues to be an enigma for many people. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and we'll get going here. So just bear with me a moment. All right. So hopefully, let's see here. You're going to be seeing my screen here in just a moment. All right. Are you seeing my screen okay? Somebody want to just give me a pause if you can see my slide?
I can see it very well.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Great. Okay, so I titled this presentation for you, Where is the True Church? Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Dialogue with Seventh-day Adventist Ecclesial Ethics. And I intended, we'll see how the time goes, but I intended to kind of break it into two parts. The first was to just kind of maybe give a brief overview of Bonhoeffer's life. So who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and to talk briefly about why I'm interested in Bonhoeffer's life and work. And then the second part of this would be to talk about what I've been doing with my research in Bonhoeffer studies. Okay. So who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Well, I guess let's start with just where he was born. He was born in Breslau, Germany, which is today modern Poland, on February 4th of February 1906. He had a twin sister, Sabine, and Bonhoeffer's parents. Karl Bonhoeffer was an eminent psychiatrist in the University of Berlin and from 1912 until his retirement. His mother, Paula Bonhoeffer, was descended from a family of high-class family of lawyers, theologians, and very much kind of she's a very refined woman. Her lineage was very important to her, and this kind of was passed on to her children. And she, I think, very much was an inspiration in Bonhoeffer's life and his direction to go toward theology. So you can see photos here of his parents when they were older and younger as well. You can see a picture of Bonhoeffer and his twin sister Sabine. Bonhoeffer and there's 8 children, and they were the 6th and 7th of the 8 children. And there was the younger sister who was eventually born, Suzanne. She was born in 1909. So Bonhoeffer was kind of around the age of my grandfather, who was also born in Germany around 1903. My grandfather was about 3 years older than him. My grandfather was born in Bavaria. They were preceded by older brothers, Carl Friedrich, who became a well-known physicist. He studied, and Carl Friedrich studied with Einstein and Planck. A brother, Walter, who was killed in World War I, and then another brother, Klaus. And also before them came these 2 older sisters, Ursula and Crystal. And so, as you can imagine, the Bonhoeffer house was a hub of activity, not only because of the number of children and people employed by the family to help with the household, but also because Karl Bonhoeffer's profession. And so people were coming and going. There was scientists and theologians and professors coming and going, long evening conversations about all kinds of things, academic conversations about society, politics, religion. And this is kind of the ether that Bonhoeffer grew up in and lived with. And so it very much, there's no doubt it influenced him. So it was quite an extraordinary, very proud, upper class German family. And so the decision for Bonhoeffer to become a theologian came when he was a teenager. Interestingly enough, it was against kind of very much the grain of his family. although he was descended from theologians on his mother's side, neither theology nor church life really played a large role in his immediate family context. So they didn't go to church regularly, even though maybe they would have conversations. I mean, he was his nurse as a child grew up. She taught him Bible stories and things like that, but it wasn't a major part of their family. And so they thought that Bonhoeffer, who was a master pianist, and they thought that he'd become a musician, but instead he became a theologian. And so at home, he made no bones about it, that that's what he was going to do. And even his brothers and sisters refused to take him seriously, and he didn't though discourage him. So for example, there's a great story kind of in the Bonhoeffer stories that are told about him, that when he was a kid, his parent, his brother and his father were kind of challenging him about it, and they told him, like, why would you want to waste your time on this feeble, boring, petty bourgeois institution? And he confidently replied to him, in that case, he said, I shall reform it. And so Bonhoeffer's decision to study theology took him to Tübingen from 1920 through 1924, and then on eventually to Berlin. And it was in Berlin that he studied with one of his very famous relatives, Karl von Harnack, studied with Karl Hohl, and he also studied with Reinhold Seeberg, who he did his doctoral work under. And so these are some of the most important theologians of their day. And it was during this time that Bonhoeffer stood out as a very exceptional thinker and applying himself both to philosophy and theology. And it was, and they also Seeberg and Hohl, both Luther scholars, and Luther very much was influential in Bonhoeffer's work. I mean, Luther is someone he quotes constantly and throughout his lifetime. It was also during this time that he began to read another key influence, and that was the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. And in many respects, it was these two. It was Luther and Barth, these giants that kind of hover over Bonhoeffer's background and influence his theology. Bonhoeffer completed his studies in Berlin by writing his doctoral dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, in his early 20s. Extraordinary feat. And it was in this text that Bonhoeffer explorates the nature of the church community. He engages with social theory of the day. This is where he first has this idea of Christ existing as community. He was very much influenced by Barth in this. He felt that Barth's theology was too transcendent. And so Bonhoeffer thought to place God's revelation in the church, Christ existing as community. So Christ existing socially, in a sense, God being revealed socially in the church. So then it was after completing this that he spent some time in Barcelona in Spain, in a German community there as an associate pastor, assistant pastor, youth pastor. And then eventually comes back to Berlin to do his habilitation schrift, Act and Being, which is an extremely dense work. It was his second dissertation. What he needed to do, still to Germany this day, you have to basically do a second dissertation to teach, to be a professor in the state in Germany. So this one was interesting because, again, he was wrestling with the work of Barth in a sense. It's a book in which he engages with the question of ontology. And he's seeking to find a way to see the church as the community in which the act of God's revelation and ontology find their unity. And it's very dense. This qualifies him to be a lecturer. He does that spends about a year doing that, and he eventually heads to study for some time in Union Theological Seminary in New York. And it's during this time that Bonhoeffer is introduced to a variety of influences that continue to shape his theologically throughout the rest of his life. Probably the two most important figures here, some of the most is Jean Lassalle. There's, you can see real quick, I'll circle, you can see Bonhoeffer here. Here you can see another, this is Frank Fisher, an African-American scholar fellow student and scholar who introduced him to the plight of the Black church in Harlem and the Abyssinian Baptist Church. Here's Reinhold Niebuhr, who is the lead professor of the group. And here is Paul Lehmann, one of his classmates, another important American theologian. But probably the person really at this time that was really influential is this name I mentioned, Jean Lassalle. He was a French theologian who has come to study as well at Union. What's interesting is here you have a French and a German who become very dear friends, and at this time it was still there was a lot of animosity between French people and German people because of what had happened after the war. And so they become friends. It's Lasari that introduced Bonhoeffer to the Sermon on the Mount, and Lasari was a pacifist, and this was extraordinary, like a different way of thinking than Bonhoeffer had ever been exposed to, as well as his experience with Frank Fisher right there, the African American. These two figures are really prominent. So eventually, Bonhoeffer returns to Germany and picks up his studies. He begins teaching, lecturing, and back in the University of Berlin. It's here where he has some of his most dense work that he does, Creation and Fall, his Christology lectures. He does an extraordinary theological exposition of Genesis 1 through 3. And Bonhoeffer had a really unique way of interpreting the Old Testament, which was completely different than the common thinking at the time in Germany among many people of academics at the time. So, I think it's probably some of his most creative work that he does. And I'll mention this later, but like say his exposition of Psalms 119, where and again, also here his Christology lectures are pretty extraordinary. Here's where he talks about Jesus as the man for others, which becomes really foundationalist thinking in the next few years. And again, we just don't have time to really get into all of that. But he spends some time in London as a pastor in London, and it's here where he gets involved with He becomes friends with Bishop George Bell of Chichester. And Bell becomes really influential in his life. Bell was involved in the ecumenical movement. Bonhoeffer becomes involved in the ecumenical movement. And I think he spends about 18 months in London before returning to Germany in the spring of 1935 to take up his new vocation. And that is the leader of the one of the 5 confessing church preaching seminaries in Finkenwalde. And so, so Bell is the one who really kind of gets him engaged with all of this. And much of Bonhoeffer's thinking here, his work on his ecumenical thinking is really interesting. We're going to come to that again here just momentarily. But Bonhoeffer in 1935 starts leading this illegal seminary in Finkenwalde. It starts in Zingst on the Baltic Sea and eventually moves to Finkenwalde, which today is in Poland. And it's probably one of the most extraordinary times in Bonhoeffer's life. And for me, this is where my interest in Bonhoeffer is in these years, when he's involved with the confessing church and the seminary. And it's his friend Bethge who will eventually write that and I quote, he says that he had finally begun a work about which he had no reservations. And he goes on to say that in the preceding years, he had been haunted by the thought that he had not yet found his true task in life. And now his new calling gave him the opportunity he longed for. And so it was this new calling was an opportunity for Bonhoeffer to live out what he had been thinking and writing about for nearly a decade. A true life together, if you will, living in community with brothers and sisters who were serious about loving God and each other and were committed to the word of God. And it's later in a circular letter to these seminarians written after the dissolution of the seminary by the Gestapo in 1937 that Bonhoeffer wrote that the matter of the proper education of preachers of the gospel is worthy of our ultimate commitment. And there's no doubt that in the following years, Bonhoeffer truly was ultimately committed to this with his whole entire life. It was during this time that he writes two of his most famous books, The Cost of Discipleship, which actually that was how the world first heard about the book, but it was originally in German, published as Discipleship. So these two books, The Cost of Discipleship, Life Together, become his two most important books that he ever wrote. Karl Barth praised discipleship as one of the greatest theological works ever written, and referred to it when he did his own in his Church Dogmatics. When Barth writes about his own kind of take on how he understands discipleship, he references Bonhoeffer there. It's during this time that Bonhoeffer has a student by the name of Eberhard Bethge, who you can see him circled here. Where Bethge becomes very dear friends, and not only a student, but a very dear friend of Bonhoeffer. And it's thanks to Bethge that we know the Bonhoeffer today. Bethke and he continue a lifelong friendship. It's the letters that are sent to Bethke out of prison when he's eventually arrested. It's Bethke who keeps track of all of his writing and his research and kind of keeps Bonhoeffer alive for us to today. Bethke will eventually marry one of Bonhoeffer's relatives, Rene Bethke, cousin. She was a cousin of Bonhoeffer. And of course, as eventually the Eberhard Bethke writes this huge, massive biography of Bonhoeffer's life, which is still the definitive biography, and it's over 1,000 pages, and it's definitely worth reading if you're highly interested in Bonhoeffer's life. But Bethke said, there's a lot of criticism about what they were doing at Finkenwalde at the seminary. Even Karl Barth wrote to Bonhoeffer, and there's an interesting letter where he was questioning Bonhoeffer. He thought he was becoming an enthusiast, and that was in German at the time. That was what they called the Anabaptists, and that was Barth's fear that that's the direction that he was going to start his own denomination, start his own church, right? And Bonhoeffer disagreed wholeheartedly. And even Bethke later showed us that this is not what was happening in Finkenwalde. And even though that's oftentimes the way even today some people interpret what was going on, there wasn't an escape from the world. It wasn't a detour, as some people criticized it. And so Bethke, here we hear him say this. He wrote this eventually in the biography about Bonhoeffer. He says, it would be a mistake to interpret this as Bonhoeffer's attempt to escape from the world. The ghetto of discipleship is not the peaceful backwater of the pietists, nor is it the otherworldliness of the visionaries, neither of whom are particularly loyal to the world. Discipleship is a call to battle. It is a concentration and hence restriction so that the entire earth may be reconquered by the infinite message. And so the Finkenwalde Seminary was eventually closed by the Gestapo in September of 1937. And so from 1938 to 1940, Bonhoeffer was involved in the collective pastorates of the Confessing Church, and he would travel back and forth at this time as well until he no longer could travel between England and even spending briefly some time in America. And it was in these years between his return to Germany and his arrest in 1943 that were marked by kind of a, best to call it maybe a nomadic existence. And for much of this time, Bonhoeffer's official residence was in Munich, as he was posted there to accomplish his official duties as a member of the military intelligence office. He avoided as long as he could being conscripted into the military. And it was thanks to his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohany, that were able to get him a job in the military intelligence office and to avoid conscription. So he spent very little time in Munich, and though he had been eventually will be banned by the authorities from public meetings and speaking, he continues to spend a considerable time back and forth in Berlin, meeting privately with members of the Confessing Church and continuing to shore up the courage of those who had led the battles against the Nazis. Part of his time, he spends in a small Bavarian village called Ettal. I went on a Bonhoeffer pilgrimage a few years ago and had a chance to visit this beautiful little Bavarian town where there's a monastery there. And it was in this monastery that I have pictured here, I'm standing in front of it there, that he wrote what will eventually be called the Ethics. He never finished it. It was a manuscript. And the irony for Bonhoeffer was that, wartime provided him kind of leisure for theological work. And this was probably one of the most important things that he worked on during this time, hiding out in this small town in this Catholic monastery. And in Ethics, we can see his passion for the church and for Christ come together, and this time in the form of a particular kind of ethic, which continues to people try to interpret. And again, it's difficult because it is all just a manuscript that he never finished. But for Bonhoeffer here, I think what mattered was not the question of what was the right thing to do, but what was the will of God. And so thinking that it's isolated from this question becomes ethics that is not oriented to the center for Bonhoeffer, which is always Jesus Christ. And so it's ethics that removes one from the reality of the world instead of taking one deeply into the reality of the world. You can kind of see this as in going deeper into the world, being more engaged with the world is a really important theme in Bonhoeffer's life. And Bonhoeffer's movement then into reality of the world led him to his involvement inevitably with a group of conspirators who desired to overthrow Hitler's government. and the establishment of a new government in Germany. And Bonhoeffer's connection to this group was his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohany, who was an officer in Germany's Abwehr, or the counterintelligence. And officially, Bonhoeffer was conscripted to be an officer in the Abwehr, but unofficially, he was a double agent who fed information about the plotters to the Allies using his connections from his time working with the ecumenical movement, and especially his relationship with George Bell. So what they would do is they were actually trying to send messages to George Bell to try to go to Winston Churchill and to try to convince Churchill that there was a growing resistance in Germany, to which sadly Churchill completely ignored. And in doing this, Bonhoeffer, what he was doing was basically committing treason. In fact, for decades, Bonhoeffer was, by many Germans, continued to be treated as considered to be a traitor against his country, because most Germans were very nationalistic. Even those who were anti-Nazi, they were very pro-military, very proud of their military, proud of serving, proud of their history, even though they were even the people that were anti-Nazi. And so there was this kind of, there was this, for many people that were part of it resisting Hitler, this kind of question of it was very cloudy and gray, and oftentimes people were still thought to be unloyal, and that was very much the case for Bonhoeffer. But he becomes a part of this plot that was thinking about committing tyrannicide. Bonhoeffer reflects on that in his work. In many ways, ethics is the way that Bonhoeffer's thinking through and making sense of what he knew he had to do. And that was, to follow Jesus doesn't mean that we can avoid ambiguity and suffering, but in fact means that we must be willing to enter into deep ambiguity and suffering, which is certainly what Bonhoeffer did. Ultimately, Bonhoeffer's work with the conspirators was discovered, as you probably know. And it was in the spring of 1943, in his home with his parents. He was that he was arrested and sent to Tegel prison in Berlin. And it was here that he spent the bulk of the next 2 years of his life reading, comforting his fellow prisoners, and thinking deeply about the future of Christianity in a post-war world. In fact, that's why he went back to America. Many people were hoping that he was going to stay there and he was going to be a Paul Tillich, right, and get a teaching position and be just like Tillich did. But Bonhoeffer got back to Union Seminary, and within a matter of weeks was on his way back to Germany, because he felt like if he didn't go back, he wouldn't be able to be there to help prepare a post-war Germany and bring it back to restoration in the future. And so ironically, because he was considered a traitor, he went back to Germany out of loyalty to and love for his homeland. And it was during this time in Tegel prison that Bonhoeffer began to compose the letters that would become so important to his theological legacy, some of his most creative theological thinking. And it's here that we find in these letters his thoughts regarding the need for Christianity to rethink itself, to understand more deeply its essence, and to be better equipped to engage with life in the world, in the world come of age. Again, when I spent some time in Germany a few years ago, and on this Bonhoeffer pilgrimage I went to Berlin to the State Library, and was able to, in my limited German, be able to communicate with the librarian in the archives, and I was able to get access to a whole bunch of original manuscripts and documents of Bonhoeffer's that are kept there. And I was able to find one of the things that he did in the Letters and Papers of Prison, which, next to Discipleship and Life Together, probably his most famous works. Again, it was never a book that he wrote. It was just a collection of these smuggled out letters. But he wrote a novel while he was in there, wrote fiction. He wrote a lot of poetry, and his poetry is absolutely beautiful. I'm actually holding, I can't believe it. I literally had chills holding the original poem that he wrote in Tegel prison, and holding it in my hand, my most beloved Bonhoeffer poem, which is called, which in German is there. I can't remember what it's called in German, but anyways, it's Who Am I? And it reads, I'll just read the last little bit of the poem. He says, "Who am I, this or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both am I both at once a hypocrite before others and before myself a contemptible, woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou dost know, God, I am thine. It's absolutely just an absolutely beautiful, moving poem. Unfortunately, Bonhoeffer was unable to bring his thoughts in prison letters to fruition. And so it was kind of stuck in time, in a sense, leaving us till this day, trying to interpret what he meant, and which is oftentimes a little bit cryptic. But it was after the failed attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20 of 1944. If you want to watch the Tom Cruise film Valkyrie, that's the assassination attempt that this is referring to. That Bonhoeffer was found on a long list of people who were involved with that. And so Fuhrer lost his mind, and he set out to eliminate all of them, all of his political enemies that were involved. They were all arrested. And it was through more thorough investigation. Bonhoeffer was actually in prison for a while before they actually found this document with his name on it. And so Bonhoeffer's connection to the conspirators finally came to light, and which was all but assuring his death. And so on April 9, 1945, Bonhoeffer was hanged at the Flossenburg concentration camp on the border of the Czech Republic today. And again, I had a chance to travel here. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere near Passau in Germany, southern border of Germany. We're bordered to Czechoslovakia near Austria borders. And it's just an amazing place to visit and spend some time and to think about what occurred there. So yeah, so that's a quick overview of his life. And let me just share a bit, why am I interested in Bonhoeffer? I think I was first introduced to Dietrich Bonhoeffer when I was in seminary. The Cost of Discipleship book was referred to me, and it was quoted by Dr. Randall Wisby, who, before he was the president at La Sierra, he was our professor at seminary in the Center for Youth Ministry. And he was one of my beloved teachers. And that was where I was first exposed to Bonhoeffer. I'd never heard of him before and his story, and I was really compelled by it. And it wasn't until I was a pastor, maybe 12, 13, 14 years ago or so, that I wanted to read more about Bonhoeffer, and I grabbed a biography. It was the Eric Metaxas biography. And then I happened to read Christian Century book review about the book, where Clifford Green, a Bonhoeffer scholar, which basically shredded Eric Metaxas in his book, and recommended another book by Ferdinand Schlingensiepen, a German that had written a book on Bonhoeffer at the same time that Metaxas did, and said this is a much preferable book to read, which I got a hold of, and it was an extraordinary book. And I went deeper and deeper into Bonhoeffer at that point. But I really resonate with what Andrew Root wrote not too long ago. Well, it's been a while, back in 2006. It's something I came across where he was reflecting on Bonhoeffer as a practical theologian. And he says, seeing his theology as Bonhoeffer as interdisciplinary, practice-oriented, ministry-focused, and interpretively directed, it seems fitting to claim him as a practical theologian. And as a practical theologian, I guess that's the closest thing I can think of myself as a practical theologian. I really identify with that. And I think Ben Bethke, maybe, a practical theologian in Germany compared to what a practical theologian today is in America might be a little different. But Bethke thought of Bonhoeffer as well as a practical theologian. He even wrote this in his biography. He said Bonhoeffer presented his first attempt at a lecture using the topic of his own starting point, the church, and his listeners were captivated because with each chapter, the systematic thinker came so surprisingly close to practical theology. I'm really fascinated with this time in history. I'm not so much fascinated. I don't care so much about World War II. I used to more when I was a history major at Southern Adventist University years ago, and working with Dr. MacArthur and Doug Morgan. But now today, I'm much more interested in the Weimar Republic years and the rise of National Socialism and the church's role and all of that, and church history in that time period. I find it very fascinating. And what I find so extraordinary about Bonhoeffer is that Bonhoeffer, I don't care more than any, I can't find another theologian. I can't think of another one whose life story is so dramatic, so connected, so dramatic life story is so connected to his theology. And Bonhoeffer lived his theology. It was he just didn't sit out. He didn't just sit in an office somewhere writing manuscripts, theological manuscripts, church dogmatics, whatever. He never wrote a systematic theology, even though many people consider him, as some say he's a systematic theologian, others say practical theologian, whatever. But Bonhoeffer's theology was deeply embedded in his life. And it was and Bonhoeffer uses it was very concrete for Bonhoeffer. And the church, everything for Bonhoeffer was about the church. Everything he did was for his love of the church and that was centered in Jesus Christ. And so that's one of the things that draws me so much to Bonhoeffer. I think most people obviously are drawn to him because he has this compelling story. Oftentimes he's seen as a martyr, a saint. I don't know if any of those names are accurate or not. It's just kind of surface level. He's the popularized version of Bonhoeffer. He's kind of this heroic, saintly figure. I don't know if that's really realistic, but I think the more you see the real Bonhoeffer, the more I see this person who tried to be faithful to Jesus Christ and to live out his faith as honestly as he could and to make sense of that at a time, and just had an extraordinary ability to be able to see the signs of the times and be able to work through that in a way that he felt was obedient to Jesus. All right. So that's the first half. Okay. So let's get to the second half here of what I want. Everybody doing okay? All right. So what am I doing with my research in Bonhoeffer studies? All right. So that's where this leads me to my official title of this presentation. Where is the true church? Dietrich Bonhoeffer in dialogue with Seventh-day Adventist ecclesial ethics. And so here, I'm going to go ahead and start with another one of my favorite theologians, Stanley Hauerwas. And a famous dictum of Hauerwas, he's quoted over and over in various places by people, but this quote: "The church does not have a social ethic. The church is a social ethic." I struggle with Hauerwas on this. I really do, because while I believe it, I really do believe the church is a social ethic. Most of the time, it seems to me the church just talks about having a social ethic. And while Hauerwas's claim I think is very compelling, sadly I think that the empirical evidence for such a claim often seems to be lacking. And I say this after serving as a pastor for 20 years, now a professor for a number of years, being very deeply involved in the church. I think that we can all probably point to cases past and present where Seventh-day Adventists have failed to be the truth, all the while claiming to have the truth. And I think that this is especially troubling when we consider the high value Seventh-day Adventists have historically placed on being a true church. Notice the semantics there are important. I said being a true church. Some might say being the true church, but being a true church and its influence on the development of the denomination's ecclesiology. And so, again, we can probably come up with many examples throughout Seventh-day Adventist history where the denomination's ecclesial distinctiveness did not lead to what I call ethical responsibility, despite the church's claims of doctrinal purity. And so one such case took place in Germany during the 1930s and 40s, when most Christians in Germany, especially the National Church of Germany, capitulated to the National Socialism, even embraced National Socialism, and saw it as a way of restoring Germany to its greatness. But it wasn't just the National Church. Other free churches also capitulated and to the Nazis and embraced National Socialism. More than 2 decades ago, Ronald Blaish, I think that's how you say Professor Blaish's name, but I could be slaughtering it. But an Adventist church historian, I'm sure many of you are acquainted with his work. He published a paper in the Journal of Central European History titled "Religion Under National Socialism, the Case of the German Adventist Church," which showed that German Adventist leaders' inability to resist National Socialism was due in part to Seventh-day Adventist eschatology, which plays, as we know, a significant role in the formation of the denomination's ecclesiology. And so at the time, Blach argued the case of the German Adventists in the 1930s and 40s had significant implications for contemporary Seventh-day Adventist ecclesiology. And one of the most significant implications concerns the denomination's ability to be ethically responsible during times of socio-political crisis. And this is just an example. I find this stunning, that here's Walter Mueller, the president of the East German Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists in Der Adventbot in August of 1933, praising Hitler. The Christian welcomes with joy the reawakening of Germany and the fight of the Hitler government against unemployment. He is happy for the defense of Christianity, for morality and order, incorruptibility and justice in government, for attack on class consciousness, and the elevation of the ethnic communities, the Volksgemeinschaft. The Christian is happy to know that the direction of his country is in the hands of a man like Hitler, who frequently emphasizes that he received his post from God, to whom he is responsible. A non-drinker, a non-smoker, and a vegetarian, he stands close to our conception of the reformer of life. So some points here, I'll just make several points here of where I find this and how I connect this with Bonhoeffer, or I'm trying to. But in considering, I think, such ethical dilemmas throughout Adventist history, I think that the church's ecclesiology has not always aided the movement in acting as a true church in difficult times. It's professed in official church doctrinal statements and church polity. And, Rick Rice, has talked about this frequently. He said, Rick Rice says, he said this almost 20 years ago, that ecclesiology has received little attention in Seventh-day Adventist studies. Even quote Rice from his book Reign of God, that the doctrine of the church is one of the least developed aspects of Seventh-day Adventist theology. And I think still it's gotten better, but still it's something that we haven't spent time in. Some people would even question, do we even have an ecclesiology? But anyways, saying that and going back and considering Hauerwas's claim that I started with, that the church is a social ethics, that there's a growing need, I believe, among Seventh-day Adventists for critical discussion on the ethical nature of the denomination's ecclesiology in light of the many critical socio-political situations around the world which challenge the church to action. And ultimately, in doing all of this, I hope that what I'm saying here is considered as generative in the sense that, I want the best for the church. And so my question here is, how are we to be a true church for such a time as this? And so so questions concerning the ethical nature of the church, particularly during times of trouble, are not unique to Seventh-day Adventists. The history of the Christian church is replete with examples of the collective ethical failures by the followers of Jesus Christ, especially during times of crisis. And I contend that these failings by the church throughout history are due in part to inadequate ecclesiologies. Now, perhaps no one understood this more clearly than the German Protestant theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and who was part of as we've seen already, the confessing church during the rise of the Third Reich. And it's due to Bonhoeffer's experience, I think, with the moral failings of the church in Germany in response to National Socialism, that he remains in a unique position to aid in discussion on the ethical nature of the church. And so I look to Dietrich Bonhoeffer as kind of a theological, ethical interlocutor. And Seventh-day Adventist ecclesiology, I think, can be enriched by a discussion with Bonhoeffer's thinking about the ethical nature of the church, particularly within the historical developments of Germany in the 1930s. Now, we can take the entire Bonhoeffer corpus into account. It's for his short life, it's massive. I think right now in the English Works edition, we have 17 volumes of materials. The first 4, 5, 6 volumes are all original material, and the rest are all additional supplemental material, different manuscripts, letters, sermons, things that he preached. But we have his massive corpus. But I really find that the tumultuous years of the 1930s is particularly suited for dialogue with Seventh-day Adventist ecclesiology, because the 1930s were formative years for Bonhoeffer in extraordinary ways, because it's during the decade of the 30s that Bonhoeffer's concept of the sanctorum communio become increasingly concrete. From his year abroad in America to his growing friendship with Karl Barth, his pastorates in London to his engagements with the ecumenical movement in Europe, his debates with the German Christians to his participation in the church struggle, his leadership in the preacher's seminary at Finkenwalde to his resistance against the National Socialism and the Nazi regime, we can only speculate how Bonhoeffer's understanding of the church might have evolved differently had he not experienced these lived situations with the church during such tumultuous period in history. And so Bonhoeffer is this rare theologian who works out his ecclesiology in concrete ways, removed from the cloistered walls of academia under the pressure of extraordinary real world situations confronting the church. And here, just to support one of my argument here is I draw on the former International Bonhoeffer Society president, a scholar by the name of German theologian and Bonhoeffer scholar Fritz de Lang, on Bonhoeffer's concrete witness. And de Lang says this. He says, it was a one authentic theology, not abstracted from the concrete personal life of the one who was doing it, but was rooted in a powerful Christian engagement. It was a dialogical theology, not an isolated product of an interior monologue of an academic theologian in a study, but the experimental and fragmentary result of an open process of a questioning and response. And above all, it was a theology that spoke of God in the midst of life, not at its borders. It was a theology that asked believers to live a worldly life without reservations and without the escape into what Bonhoeffer called religions. And one of Bonhoeffer's most recent biographers, who I've already referenced, Ferdinand Schlingensiepen, seems to agree because he describes Bonhoeffer's life during this period as a transition from the abstraction of the academy to the concrete reality of the church, where Bonhoeffer is discovering, and I'll quote him, discovering new radical questions and trying to answer them. And he says this: if his church is no longer the true church, then where is the true church? And to this I would raise the question, I think here, what is the ethical nature then of the true church? And so I think, in fact, this is Schlingensiepen's last point here regarding Bonhoeffer's quest for the church, I think takes us to this kind of central question, right? And so one of the most significant ecclesial situations Bonhoeffer faces during the 1930s concerns the moral integrity of the Protestant church in Germany. Because like Schlingensiepen, another Bonhoeffer scholar, Galen Barker, one of the editors of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works English edition, Barker has described this period in Bonhoeffer's life as a battle for the true church, a battle over the Nazification of the Christian faith through such measures as something called the Arian Clause in 1933, where anyone with Jewish descent could no longer be employed in any kind of national government. And this included the church. And so Bonhoeffer did not have a clean record on this. He refused to do was it a baptism for a family member because of their Jewish background. And so this was a really troubling time at first, people trying to navigate this. And this was the heart of the battle, which eventually led to what we know as the Barmen Declaration, which Bonhoeffer is a part of that, but the Barmen Declaration was written by Karl Barth. And Galen Barker says about this time period, he says, this is in his introductory essay to Bonhoeffer Works English edition, Barker goes so far as to claim that this fight for the true church in Germany at the time was a status confessionis for the confessing church, right? This is something that you live or die on. And Bonhoeffer even will eventually write this really, really dramatic, controversial essay, which put him in the radical part of the confessing church, where he basically said, either you line up with the true church or you're going to be lost. And people lost their minds that he could say something like that. It even sounds like a really right-wing conservative Adventist claim at that point in this essay. And it still bothers people till today trying to make sense of what he meant by that, right? If you're not part of the confessing church, you won't have salvation. But Barker goes on to say that what Bonhoeffer was doing this time was identifying the threats to the church and its witness, and drawing distinctions between the true church and what he perceived that the Protestant church of Germany had become a false church. But yet, I would say that some of Bonhoeffer's own thoughts on this period are prove the most compelling. So, for example, in a letter from Finkenwald at the seminary during the summer of 1935 to Secretary General Leonard Hodgson of the Faith and Order group, this was part of the ecumenical church at the time, Bonhoeffer writes, "We have to fight for the sake of the true church of Christ against the false church of the Antichrist. Fighting in this faith, we derive no small power from considering the fact that we are fighting for Christianity, not only with regard to the church in Germany, but in the whole world. The fight over the true church in Germany was more than a doctrinal battle, but instead it held real-world ethical implications, which became a matter of life and death." Excuse me. And so here's some key points that I want to make that I think we can see if we enter into dialogue about this with Bonhoeffer. So despite the many theological differences that exist between Bonhoeffer and Seventh-day Adventists, and there are many, it's I'm not trying to make Bonhoeffer out to be a Seventh-day Adventist by any means here. I mean, he was a liberally trained German Protestant theologian, fully enmeshed in the time and place of his historical period. But I think that the language that he's using here should resonate with Seventh-day Adventists. We can relate to this for what he's saying. Because like Bonhoeffer in Germany during the 1930s, Adventists seek to remain faithful to Jesus Christ during a time of apostasy in the church. They share Bonhoeffer's conviction to stand between obedience and disobedience to our very Lord Jesus Christ, to quote Bonhoeffer. So Bonhoeffer's words here from Hodgson's letter express an essential organizing idea in Seventh-day Adventist ecclesiology. So consider Revelation 12:17, an essential text for Seventh-day Adventist ecclesial identity. The text we know reads, "Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus." And Seventh-day Adventists have historically understood that the rest of her offspring to be a remnant of the true church, a community of people who remain faithful to God during a time of widespread apostasy in the church. And according to Seventh-day Adventists, this remnant comprises all those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So then, when we come to Revelation 12:17, right, I think that this presents an example of how a dialogue with Dietrich Bonhoeffer may be beneficial for the denomination's thinking about the ethical nature of the church. Because, really, think about it, when Adventists discuss the meaning of the biblical remnant, and particularly here in Revelation chapter 12, they focus primarily on, I would argue, the theological meaning of remnant. And Adventists, though, rarely focus on the ethical meaning of remnant. And I think that's rather ironic, considering the weight we place on keeping the commandments of God in our ecclesial identity. And one of the most glaring examples of this ecclesial irony may be seen in the emphasis Seventh-day Adventists place upon the fourth commandment, right? Which is, that's like the most important commandment of all the biblical commands. The fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy, plays the most significant role in the formation of Seventh-day Adventist ecclesial identity. Yet, when it comes to the fourth commandment, most Seventh-day Adventist scholarship has focused on the theological meaning of the Sabbath rather than the ethical meaning of the Sabbath. And to just back myself up here, I'm going to quote one of the most significant Adventist authorities on this, who's written extensively of this, our own Dr. Sigve Tonstad. Because while there has been attempts within Seventh-day Adventist scholarship to recognize the ethical dimensions of the Sabbath, I think Tonstad, Sigve, he stands out as the most significant attempt, I think, in his book, The Lost Meaning of the Seventh Day, where while Tonstad primarily offers a theological exposition of the Sabbath, he does make a move here in the book to reflect on the ethical dimension of Sabbath. And I'll just cite here from his chapter on the social consciousness of the Sabbath, where he observes that, and I'll quote him, social consciousness is inseparably intertwined with its ideology. Subtle and implicit at first, the social and ecological thrust of the seventh day becomes increasingly prominent over time. And indeed, the seventh day must be seen as the launching pad for the most exceptional, ambitious project of social justice in the ancient world. We might even speak of a Sabbatized vision of reality. And as we shall see, the most distinctive prophetic voices of the Old Testament line up behind this vision. So with this in mind, what I argue is that Seventh-day Adventists need to give more attention to the ethical dimensions of the biblical remnant as they continue to develop their ecclesiology. And I think that this point is precisely where Bonhoeffer proves beneficial to such a discussion. So for example, I argue that the concrete commandments of God, that this is a phrase that you come across in Bonhoeffer, they're central in Bonhoeffer's thinking during the 1930s. And one of the earliest examples I draw on may be seen during Bonhoeffer's years abroad in America, where he is introduced to a new way of reading the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most important theological developments of his life. And there it's through his friend, his classmate, colleague of his, Gene Lasari, that he's introduced to Jesus' peace commandment. And it's for the first time in his life that Bonhoeffer is confronted with a new way of reading the teachings of Jesus and their ethical demands on discipleship. And so some of Bonhoeffer's interpreters have seen this new understanding of the Sermon on the Mount as a conversionary experience. If a Lutheran could have that, right, at his age, at his point in his life. So for example, in a letter to his friend Elizabeth Zinn in 1936, Bonhoeffer, writing from the Preacher's Seminary at Finkenwalde, reflects on how his new reading of the Sermon on the Mount was a transformational experience. And I'll cite this here. Bonhoeffer himself in this letter says, "Then something different came, something that has changed and transformed my life to this very day. For the first time, I came to the Bible. And that too is an awful thing to say. I had often preached, I had seen a great deal of the church, had spoken and written about it, and yet I was not yet a Christian, but rather in an utterly wild and uncontrolled fashion my own master. I do know that at the time I turned the cause of Jesus Christ into an advantage for myself, for my crazy vanity. I prayed to God that that will never happen again. Nor had I ever prayed, or had done so only very rarely. Despite this isolation, I was quite happy with myself. The Bible, especially the Sermon on the Mount, freed me from all this. Since then, everything has changed. I have felt this plainly, and so have other people around me. That was a great liberation. It became clear to me that the life of a servant of Jesus Christ must belong to the church, and step by step, it became clear to me how far it must go. And then came the crisis of 1933. That's Hitler coming to power, and this strengthened me in it." Powerful testimony of how he was transformed by a new understanding of the Sermon on the Mount. And even by Betka will go on to claim that Lasari's impact stayed with Bonhoeffer for the rest of his life. And Bonhoeffer's new reading of the Sermon on the Mount also played a significant role in bolstering his position during the church struggle. So, for example, in a letter to his dear friend Erwin Sutzi, who he was at union with in the spring of 1934, Bonhoeffer goes so far as to claim the Sermon on the Mount as, quote, "the deciding word on this, the church struggle's whole affair." So Bonhoeffer's thinking here about the concrete commands of God and their import for understanding the ethical nature of the church needs to receive more attention. I don't have time to do that all right here. But again, I think that Dietrich Bonhoeffer has much to offer Seventh-day Adventist ecclesiology, especially when we consider the nature of the church and its concrete ethical existence, particularly in times of trouble, or as we Adventists like to say, for such a time as this. Now, in the summer of 1931, backing up a little bit here from late, Bonhoeffer, very young at this time still, he actually was involved in writing a Lutheran catechism, a shortened Lutheran catechism titled "As You Believe, So You Receive." He wrote it with his friend Franz Hildebrandt. And Betke would later refer to it as a revolutionary task, an enthusiastic, liberal, and essential experiment. Bonhoeffer is the primary contributor of the Catechism, and he's wrestling with all kinds of contemporary issues: science, war, peace, ecumenism. And Betke describes it as a work lying somewhere between systematic theology and praxis. And it's in this catechism that Bonhoeffer, the good Lutheran that he is, writes, the true church is where preaching stands and falls with the pure gospel of a gracious God over against all human self-righteousness. It's where the sacraments depend on the word of Christ without any element of magic. It is where the community of the Spirit exists in service and not in domination. And again, I think here early on, we see this young Bonhoeffer already beginning to differentiate between the true and the false church. But I think it's not until the church struggle a few years later that this really begins to take hold in Bonhoeffer and in his life. And it truly begins to be worked out later in his life. Once the legal seminary is shut down, he's no longer allowed to write, no longer allowed to speak publicly. And it's just before Bonhoeffer is arrested, that Bonhoeffer writes a essay called "After 10 Years." And I'll just share this in conclusion here. He writes an essay called "After 10 Years." It's kind of an essay to his compatriots who are part of the Confessing Church. Many of them were not believers themselves. The Confessing Church. They are part of the resistance. And he reflects on the 10 years of being a part of the resistance and what have they learned. And for me, it's one of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's most perplexing ideas. And it was, again, written shortly before his arrest by the Gestapo in 1943. And I think he's reflecting here in part on why seemingly intelligent people, even Christians of significant moral conviction, failed to resist the tyranny of Hitler's Nazi regime. And he rhetorically asks, who stands firm? And his answer is only the one whose ultimate standard is not his reason, his principles, conscience, freedom, or virtue. Only the one who is prepared to sacrifice all of these when in faith and relationship to God alone, he is called to obedient and responsible action. This continues to challenge me. What does that look like for the church to be obedient and to take on responsible action in light of that? And so I think that here we can query as to what Bonhoeffer meant by one's ultimate standard. What does he mean by reason, principles, conscience, freedom, virtue? These are, and ultimately, what does it mean to be obedient? And what does that look like in our lives? And for me, and just a quick, I think where I'm landing on this more and more is in his ethics, where he talks about ethics as formation. But in particular, to read that alongside his exegesis of Psalms 119, and that ethics as a way, that you don't have it all you don't have all the answers before you get there, that you sort it out in faithfulness to Jesus Christ, and kind of this, as Bonhoeffer began early on in Sanctorum Community, he uses this German word, Stellvertretung, vicarious representative action, that Jesus was our Stellvertretung, that he vicariously represented us, and we're called into that life, and no matter the cost. And so this always ends up as looking like obedience, right? Anyways, there's a lot more we could talk about this. Maybe we can explore it in the Q&A, but this is kind of where I'm wrestling with this is all kind of going, and I'm wrestling with and trying to work through. But anyhow, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much to you. I have asked a friend of ours, Jere deJesus, to comment now on Bonhoeffer as well, giving him only 5 minutes. Why Jere deJesus? Because he was the teaching assistant for a course called The Life and Thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer at Fuller Theological Seminary. I don't know, Jeff, if you took that course?
No, I did not.
Okay, so I've asked Jere to comment on this just a little bit, on the theological aspects of it, not of the life of Bonhoeffer so much. And I asked Jerry to do this, Dr. deJesus to do this, before I realized that Jeff was going to put so much emphasis upon ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. And I think Jerry is particularly prepared to discuss that because he has served in leadership roles in a Baptist community, in an Adventist community, and an Episcopalian community. So he has a sense of what the church looks like and feels like in these various places. Now, Jerry, can you hear me?
I can, my brother. It's good to.
Okay, here you go.
And thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful presentation to
Hi.
one of the theologians that has shaped my consciousness in very profound ways. I want to say that it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology that moved me from being a Marxist liberation theologian and to a certain degree submitting to ideology in many ways. I think there's a lot of wonderful things in liberation theology, but it was through the teaching of Dr. Ray Anderson at Fuller Theological Seminary, who passed. He was my theological mentor.
Wow.
He was the teacher of record, and I was his TA.
Wow.
So Ray probably was the one who showed me that one did not have to reduce oneself to ideology, that there was enough in Christology, specifically in Bonhoeffer's theology, where we can see the role of the church in ethics. For me, real briefly, because my time is limited, how Bonhoeffer influenced me was how to make sense of his theology in the light of my own context, the Latino reality. Bonhoeffer's works has crossed over through South Africa. John DeGrucci's works on dealing with apartheid. It has worked even in the African American community with my friend Reggie Williams, who writes in the African American community, and it goes on. Bonhoeffer really lived the idea of his ethics. And, when he was at Union, he even visited the Abyssinian Baptist Church. It was a Black congregation. And remember, this was in the culture of Jim Crow. And he was this white boy sitting in an all Black church that was unheard of because he believed in this idea. But real briefly, Bonhoeffer influenced me, and Jeff, maybe you can help me, but I believe it's in his book, Christ the Center, where I think he deals with the three emphasis of Bonhoeffer, and he's trying to answer three questions that I remember. Number one, who is Jesus Christ in the world today? Number two, once we find Jesus Christ in the world today, where is he located? Where is he? Who is Jesus? Where is he located? And once we find him, what do we do? What do we do? So for Bonhoeffer, who is Jesus Christ is my neighbor. My neighbor is the one that's oppressed. So where is Jesus Christ found? He's found among the oppressed. And once we find him there, what do? Well, we fight for his freedom and liberation. Once I was able to see that, I could move beyond liberation theology. So Bonhoeffer was able to see the incarnation of Christ as crucial to the idea that God is the God who enters into humanity and becomes a social being. Mm-hmm. So Bonhoeffer picks up this theme in his early work, Sanctorum Communo, who I believe, Jeff, he writes as a young age, 17, 18 years old. This guy is, I mean, what were you and I doing at 17, 18, you know? And this guy is writing a doctoral dissertation on the sociality of God. Mm-hmm. And in light of that, he was able to then deal with those three questions that he later writes, you know, who is Christ? Where is he found? What do we do? So that God is a social being. And in doing that, Bonhoeffer, in a sense, was able to locate the church among the poor, locate church among the oppressed, and much less concerned about what you thought and more about who you are. So that Bonhoeffer's brilliance was that he was able to develop a sociality of his Christology. Mm-hmm. It was less about what you thought and more about the very social nature of relationships. So there was a story that Ray would tell us that once when he was in prison, Bonhoeffer decided to do communion. And there were several people that were Christians in the room, but one was a communist, an atheist. And Bonhoeffer says, well, this is not the full body of Christ unless you, my brother, participate in it. It was less about what you thought and much more about the reality of Christ present in the oppressed communist also, the outsider. That was revolutionary for a time in Lutheranism where orthodoxy was crucial, right thinking. So it's the struggle between right thinking and right doing. And Bonhoeffer stood on the side of those ethics. And because of that, he was then able to write his ethics. To do that, Bonhoeffer had to really think about how oppressed people think and how people who are unchurched think. And he had to deal with the issue of morality, because there was morality as interpreted by those that are in power, and there is morality as interpreted by those that are poor. So that the poor sometimes do things that are apparently immoral, but can lead them to justice. For example, why he wasn't able to plot the assassination. He had to think through carefully that he was going to conspire to do something that was so against the command of God. And that's why his ethics was so powerful. He would say things sort of like, I'd rather trust a good person who does evil than to trust an evil person who does good. Fascinating stuff. Mm-hmm. Or he would make comments that had to deal with us rethinking through the nature of what morality is in the light of oppression. So Bonhoeffer was a big influence in being able to deal with his sociality, his concept of sociality. There was no separation between what you believe and what you do. So for Bonhoeffer, it was almost unfathomable that you can believe in Christ and still be an advocate for what the Nazis were advocating for. He found that as a deep contradiction and paid a heavy price for that. So in a nutshell, I think that's the major contributions Bonhoeffer did for me, was his concept of sociality and his ability to move beyond correct orthodoxy, right ways of thinking. Because when he was able to see his professors of theology, who all had great orthodoxy and great ways of thinking, saluting the Third Reich, he said, we have a problem here. We have a problem here, and paid the price for it. So I see Bonhoeffer's influence in that respect. And lastly, before in terms of the Sabbath theology, Ray brilliantly was able to share with us a concept of Bonhoeffer that I thought, when I was involved with the Adventist community, and actually included it in my doctoral dissertation. And it's his concept of the ultimate and the penultimate that you find in his book, I believe is Ethics.
Yes.
And Ray said that in a real sense, the penultimate is the sixth day. The penultimate is where we all live, and the ultimate is the seventh day, in a sense. It's the closing of history where peace and justice exist. And in a real sense, I think as an Adventist community, we can really think through that in a real sense, Bonhoeffer might have said in an Adventist context, you guys got something here that the church can really benefit from. We speak about the Sabbath as the closing of world history, the place of justice and peace. Well, if we have the Spirit of God that comes from the ultimate, from the last day, he comes to the penultimate in the sixth day in Christ. And so that we have, in a sense, the justice, the peace, the jubilee of the seventh day that we live through in our ecclesiology and our ethics on the penultimate, on the sixth day. And I found that dialectic rather fascinating. You could have a lot of fun with that theologically, with that concept. And I did. I milked that concept.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Because it really helped me with trying to understand the Sabbath from an ethics perspective, a social justice perspective, rather than keep it in the place of abstract thinking.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic.
All right. Yeah.
I did not see that one coming. I'm glad you spoke. I did not think of Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, where is the? I appreciate that. All you shared very much. And I appreciate Ray Anderson very much as well. I've read a lot of his work, and when I was first introduced to him when I was doing my doctoral work at Fuller. So, where does he reference that, to recite Bonhoeffer and his work on that, on the Sabbath and the penultimate and the ultimate?
Ray didn't reference it, I think, specifically in any of his. He might have.
More conversation you had.
Yeah, it's more in the middle of the classroom. We would have these deep conversations, and that thought really triggered with me
Yeah.
and stayed with me.
No, I
And I
want to
remember speaking
yeah.
to Ray about it, and he said, "Yes, write
Beautiful.
about it,
It's
develop
beautiful.
it."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it.
Thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, Ray Anderson was a crucial man in my life.
Yeah.
I actually had him one day, Dave, speak at Loma Linda.
Yeah.
He spoke at Loma Linda one time. I got him there to speak before he passed away. And he had a very ecumenical spirit, which I inherited because I do too. And but he was a big influence in my life. Thank you, Jeff, for what you're writing about a man that has deeply impacted my life. Thank you, brother.
Yeah,
wonderful. Wonderful. Jeff, how long can you stay by?
I can stay till 12:30.
Okay, let's not take a break then. Let's take full advantage of Jeff's presence. And our sheriff for this morning is Professor Monty Butler. Over to you, Monty.
All right, AKA Monty. Okay, everyone, just a little bit of time for us. So let's definitely keep it to single question and short questions. And Simona has her hand up. Simona, start us out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. And thank you also, Jere, for your comments. I was really struck by this idea, which I believe that our life through 6 days has to be in line with our worship on the seventh day. But I have been thinking about this for a long time, and this week, because of the things that happened in Italy, I'm deeply concerned. I'm deeply concerned that people who call themselves Christians cannot even recognize evil anymore. What does that say about our claim to follow Jesus when we cannot recognize fascism, rising fascism, overt fascism, that members of our church are voting for people who are clearly people without conscience and without any redeeming qualities and any values? What does that say about our life today? Because I see so many parallels between 1930s Germany and today's world, and it scares me to death.
Jeff, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm just curious. Thank you, Simona. I agree. And I'm just curious, is there, what would be your question there? I completely agree with you.
My question is, how is it possible that the church, that people who claim to follow Jesus cannot even recognize evil anymore?
Well, you could read Bonhoeffer's essay and later his papers on stupidity. In fact, there's an Adventist theologian scholar from Friedensau who just did a Sabbath school session this summer for Adventist Theological Society Sabbath School. You can find it online. He did a great exposition of the stupidity writings. I don't know, Dr. Seuss, if you want to say something about that, but it's really interesting. And I think this is the constant challenge that we have, trying to navigate our time and place. It's very easy for me to quote Adventists writing the review in Germany and how praising Hitler, but are we not doing the same thing? And I think going back to making Jesus Christ the center and being obedient to the fact that Jesus calls us to be with the oppressed and be with those who are marginalized. And that's where the church is located. And instead of escaping the world, running from the world, trying to live in safety, that we have to run to the danger, run into the heat of the battle, if you will, and even to the point as the choice that Bonhoeffer made of laying down our lives. And I feel that as a church, we're more concerned about our own security and safety and protection and our own well-being. And that was what was going on in Germany at the time, and scapegoating others. And also being too overly concerned about who is in and who is out, and who is normal is a big one. And I mean, for me, that's the definition of white supremacy, which I think is very much at the heart of what's going on in America today.
I mean, I saw some
that I got from
images.
Reggie Williams, Jere.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I saw some images this week that shook me. I mean, at one of the rallies for Trump, there were people who were baptized in the name of Trump. There is a book that was published that the title is Trump as a Christ. You know, I mean, we are talking about mix of religion and politics that hasn't been seen in a very long time. And this is such a scary, scary thing given what happened last time it happened. And I'm really concerned about, you know, how our church, you know, and we are not talking only people who are, you know, we can say, well, you know, they're uneducated and they're maybe not very smart. We're talking about some of the people who are the cream of the crop, you know, people who know the history and they're still repeating its mistakes.
Okay, thank you. I've got Peter and then Bob Ford. So Peter, and I see Anastasia. Anastasia will put you in between those two.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentations, both of them. I was very sorry, Jeff, I was not able to attend your presentation from the beginning. I was not able to access the site.
Sorry.
And I regret that I lost part of it. But anyway, I like very much at least what I was able to see. Well, I read Eric Metaxas' biography. I was not able to read the biography that you mentioned that is more complete, but this is a very good biography in my view, and I learned a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Well, I like to mention that when you deal with totalitarian governments, like Hitler's government was, it's basically you don't have any other choice just to choose between martyrdom, as basically Bonhoeffer was arguing in favor. He's, I think, in cost of discipleship, or to cooperate with the government. And we can see this basically not only what happened in Germany, because Hitler was able, despite the fact that he was a dictator, he was able to reach an agreement with the church, a concordat in 1933. And he was able to mask, to cover his real intentions. And a lot of leaders, the official leaders of the church, they cooperated with Hitler. And this happened also in Eastern Europe after the fall of Nazis, the end of World War II, with the countries that fell under communist domination. It happened in Russia, in the Soviet Union, it happened in Eastern Europe, with the Adventist churches there, that they have to cooperate with the government. And this is a very, very serious problem, the attitude of the church in troubled times. That, as Bonhoeffer said, you have to choose. I mean, your ethics, basically you have to make the choice based on your faith, your relationship, direct relationship with God. Now, I have a lot of things to say about that, but I'll limit myself. I have two quick questions, if I may. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly you mean from practical theologian? What do you think? Can you explain really what a practical theologian? And another question that I have, if you can make a quick parallel between Niemöller and Bonhoeffer.
Well, this is a very good question, and I didn't know that we were going to have such an illustrious professor with us who studied with Ray Anderson. I think that who was an incredible practical theologian. Do you want to try to make a stab at what a practical theologian is? I mean, for me, I like Andrew Root, who also is connected with Fuller. I kind of first learned about Andrew Root through Chapman Clark, Dr. Chapman Clark, who's my professor at Fuller, you know, and that's how I kind of learned about practical theology. But I mean, it's not like it's not applied theology. It's I don't know if you want to say something about that, Dr. deJesus, or
yeah. Ray always called himself a practical theologian. You're absolutely correct, my brother. And while never really explaining it to us,
right.
but knowing Ray and observing others who call themselves practical theologians, I think what they're saying is it's when theology is removed from the academic guild per se, and it's contextualized in the realities that people live in. So Ray, I know, was huge on the incarnation, and so was Bonhoeffer. So the starting point is not abstract theology per se, but in practical theology, the starting point is in praxis, is in the living of life. In the reality you're found, there is God. God is found in your reality. Presence is where you're located. And that's, in a sense, as a practical theologian. And Ray being also the theologian to deal with those of us studying pastoral psychology. He would integrate Bonhoeffer into pastoral psychology. He would integrate Bonhoeffer into psychotherapy. And that's what I think he means by practical, is locating God in the reality you're in, rather than beginning from the place of academia. Begin with the place of humanity. Is practical.
Okay, I'd like to jump in on this one too, because when I was in practical theology, it meant preaching and counseling, so forth and so on. But since Don Browning at the University of Chicago Divinity School, practical theology has become much, I think it's the most difficult discipline in the theological world today. Why? Because two things. It requires the practical theologian to know a lot of sociology, psychology, and anthropology, whereas most theologians deal with philosophy, and that's it.
That's right.
And so methodologically, it's huge. The amount of material a practical theologian has to cover is vast. It's very, very difficult. Secondly, as Jere was emphasizing, theology typically has moved from ideas to what's going to be done. But practical theology not only does that, but it allows what's actually happening in the concrete world to change what we believe. So it's a two-way street. It's not just from ideas to praxis, it's from practice to ideas. It becomes a very much more interactive thing. So methodologically, it's different in terms of the content. Methodologically, it's different in terms of the multi-directional mode of reasoning. Okay, back to Monty.
Yes, so
Well,
next
can you
up
comment on the second question, Jeff?
Sure.
A quick parallel between Mueller and Bonhoeffer.
I'm sorry, Peter, what between what?
Can you make a quick parallel between Mueller and Bonhoeffer? They were both Germans, and during Hitler,
I'm missing.
they suffered both of them.
I apologize. I'm not understanding the first name.
Martin Niemöller. Martin
Niemöller.
Martin
Yes.
Niemöller. Yes.
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, Niemöller was a part of the Confessing Church. But the big difference, I would say, between, as I see Niemöller and Bonhoeffer, is that especially early on, Niemöller was a part of the German military. He was part of, I believe he was in the Navy. He was very much, he was very pro-Germany, very pro-nationalist, but was very, his fight wasn't, so it was with the German church, Christians in the church, and National Socialism's influence in the church. But he was very much a pro-German, pro-military, so that for me, and that's my understanding of Niemöller, even though he was a great thinker and very much a part of the Confessing Church and against the Arian clause at the time in the early 1930s and so on. But that was, for me, that's the big difference on Niemöller.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Anastasia, and then we'll come back to Bob. Anastasia.
Thank you very much. And I'm so very, very grateful for your scholarship. And I pray that it does get through the leadership of the Adventist Church. I'm also very grateful for Dr. Larson's, Dr. Branson's class, and Jim Walters, and maybe others like that, for the good signs of the times. When I left Greece in '64, went to Newbold, already the fascists, we saw the signs of dictatorship, the junta dictatorship in Greece that lasted for 7 years. And they actually came in power in '67. The atrocities were amazing. They were not put so much here in America because it was, and according to President Clinton later on acknowledged, American CIA sponsored, et cetera, talking about the signs of the times. I am with Simona. First of all, as citizens and scholars and teachers, we cannot ignore the global things that happen in Italy, in France, Hungary, et cetera, and we cannot ignore the signs of the times here. And I would like to ask your question is where churches are stuck. What we see, this shouldn't be actually, but an excuse maybe. We see now the white national evangelicals, not now, for quite some time, who who are involved with state, church and state, and unfortunately with fascism, racism, etc. And then we have churches like Adventist or other churches that under the umbrella of separate state and church are silent. And and I don't know what it will need besides God's help for citizens of America to understand. Not all citizens, I'm sorry, I don't mean to preach to them, but at least church members to understand. And for those that don't understand and know that you can be dividing separation of church and states by speak out, like Martin Luther King did, and others like Dr. Branson, like people in this class, to speak against those things that are the true Antichrist. We were waiting for the Antichrist. Well, has been here several times in our epoch and right now. And I'm so very thankful for you because I personally sacrificed a loving family, country, friends, and 10 years of my life that I didn't see my family. And I was beaten and lost a best friend on a shot from a, decided instead when I came here to become a student of medicine, to become a student of history and literature and linguistics, and hopefully with my life to be teaching that. But I think it's cowardly to be under the umbrella of separation of church and state. But when we see those, for first time, I've been here since 1966 and following what's going on. If this overt racism, if this overt immorality is not seen and talked against now, the only good thing might be the coming of Jesus, but we have a lot of work to do. And what do you think about the times, the signs of the times here? I thank you so much. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. I can't even imagine going through all that you have experienced in your life. That's just extraordinary. And I thank you for sharing that with us and the perspective that must give you in our time and place and all that we're going, and the kind of the help, how it helps you see the signs of the times. And, I've lived a very comfortable life. I've had it easy. I've never had to struggle, never had to suffer, never had to leave my home, never had to move to another country and try to, I've never gone through any of that. And so I am, what I'm seeing now is I'm quite pessimistic. I feel like there's lots of people that are standing up and saying, listen, look what we're doing, look where we're headed. And nobody's listening. And I don't know I don't know how many more, I don't know what it's going to take. I don't know how much more we can say or do. I just know, I just pray that I can be faithful and that I can be, that I can be on the right side of, I can be obedient, as like Bonhoeffer says, that when the time comes, that I will be obedient and responsible to Jesus Christ. No matter what the cost is to me. That's my prayer. And it's why I love that poem from Bonhoeffer, Who Am I? Because there's these moments I feel like I'm a woebegone weakling, I'm afraid to speak up. I'm afraid to say the truth. And there's other moments when, I feel like I have the courage, and it's easy to speak courageously here to you all, but it's different in the midst of the battle, in the heat of the moment. Yeah, I know.
I thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And when I was teaching junior high, and then later on college, Lutheran college, I always started with an essay that the students had to write of who am I. Thank you so much, and God bless you. Thank you.
Okay, we've come to 12:30. Jeff, Bob Ford's been holding on for a while. Can you?
Yeah, I could stay a little bit longer. Yeah.
Okay, let's do Bob Ford, and then I think McKinley and Dana's questions will have to be part of what we call our foodless potluck. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Jeff, but that's afterwards. So you'll be able to leave and people stay behind. But let's bring Bob Ford in before Dave gives us the benediction. Bob.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was wonderful. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you great.
Good. We're out camping, so I'm just using my phone.
Awesome. Awesome.
Difficult. I also want to really thank for what Gerardo Jesus said. I grew up in missionary family in Nicaragua and in Guatemala, Honduras, and I used to, when I grew up, Charlie Teal and I'm sure you know a lot about Charlie Teal, took students down to Central America to visit liberation theology groups and so on. And I really appreciate the point that Gerardo said about how Bonhoeffer says you don't have to look at an ideological Marxist or other perspective to find what it means to be a Christian and to be obedient. But I feel sad because I can remember going to the camp meeting, Pathfinder in El Salvador with young people my age who later joined the guerrillas to fight against the government. Have others that are still that fought against the government in Nicaragua, and they felt that the church was not being helpful in terms of what the real struggles that were facing people. And so I was wondering if you have any counsel or suggestion for our institutional church of today about how it can learn from the past. I mean, we have a history of rising up against oppressive, whether it be back in Ellen G. White's time against abolition, whether it's the temperance movement. What do you think it will take? Or is this something that has to be done individually or congregation by congregation? What can the institutional church learn about the mistakes of the past, where we don't really become obedient and become that kind of witness that really is needed today?
Oh, great question. This is exactly what I'm wrestling with. I'd be curious to hear what what Dr. deJesus has to say about this. Especially I thought you had a beautiful summary there of the Christology lectures and Christ the center. No, but this is constantly what I'm challenged with, and that's why I really am wrestling with what Bonhoeffer says in this after 10 years essay, and that it's not that I'm not going to make these decisions based just on principles or conscience or freedom or virtue, but just purely out of obedience to Jesus. And then and like Dr. deJesus was saying, that is centered with the those who are suffering.
Yeah. And I was just gonna simply add in the Sandinista revolution, they incorporated much of theology. And during that time, many of those that were in the Sandinista regime were professed Catholics and some were even priests, Miguel de Coto, others. There was a time there where people were debating how do we see theology in the light of the struggle of a people against oppression. And I think in hindsight, because we know what happened in Nicaragua now, and so much of what we were thinking has seemed to have gone by the wayside. There hasn't been much conversation. any longer about the role of the church in the time of revolution. There were people writing in the time, Jose Miguel Bonino doing theology in a revolutionary situation, all of them who integrated with Bonhoeffer. I think for me, in hindsight, what I see problematic is the struggle between ideology and theology. To be able to get to the core of what I think Bonhoeffer was seeking, one has to get past one's own ideological allegiances and ways of thinking, because it's easy to incorporate his theology and make it become partisan, make it become ideology.
Yes.
So that's where I see the struggle is, how do we as people of faith maintain the integrity of Christ the center and not be overcome by ideology either to the left or to the right. I think that's a major issue.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, because
Thank you very much. I
totalitarianism
agree
can
with
come from all directions.
Yeah,
Yeah. And we tend to, you know, we tend to, especially right now, we tend to kind of look at this fear of rising with fascism, but it can come in from any direction. Yeah.
All
Thank
right.
you very much. Bye. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. And Dave, back to you for our benediction.
Well, I know that Jeff has to leave, but I'd like to hear from Dana and from McKinley before we go.
Okay.
I am reluctant to turn this over to the virtual potluck because they don't want to be recorded. And I think this material is too rich not to be recorded. So I would like to hear from Dana and from McKinley, and then we can make a change.
All right. So let's go with McKinley, and then we'll go to Dana.
Thank you, Marty. You're kind. I thought you were going to alternate and go to Dana, but thank you for the opportunity.
I slipped.
Would you like to correct it? Okay,
No,
go ahead.
no, move forward.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gang, for your presentation. Good overview and the issues highlighted. Very quickly, the presentation seems to suggest that there is a difference between theology and ethics for the Christian, or at least that is something that has been struggled with. Aren't they, or shouldn't they both be two sides of the same coin? And then secondly, isn't the derivative implication then obedience, which some people are inclined to characterize as legalism? In that vein, is obedience legalism?
Great question. All right. So fantastic question. So first of all, I'm sorry if in any way that I suggest that there was the theology and ethics were somehow disconnected. They're not. I agree with you. They're completely, and I think Bonhoeffer would agree too. I think that was a problem of his time, and I think that's what he's wrestling with. I think you see that theme over and over again. And that was the problem, that German academics at the time had become completely disconnected from an ethics in the real world, and that's why he in the church and really, you know, and that's why he was talking about this a new kind of being more worldly, right? He talks about being engaging with the world. It was being more engaged. That means our theology should drive us into the world, to where Jesus is. That's what theology should be doing, not driving us away from the world and just theorizing and philosophizing and just kind of in our books and endlessly getting nowhere. And that was he felt that that's partly what led to the problem at the time in the 1930s. And then I would stick to your legalism question. Yes. I mean, look, Bonhoeffer is the Lutheran, law, grace, gospel. You read that in his definition of the true church, pure Lutheranism. Yes, he's wrestling with that too, and that comes out over and over again. But read discipleship. He's working through that, especially the first half of discipleship. He's wrestling through that in costly grace. You know, and Bonhoeffer has this brilliant point in discipleship where he says, only, and I'm going to slaughter it now. And Dr. Tace is going to correct me on this, but he says basically, only those who obey believe, and only those who believe obey. There's this kind of, there's this dialectic in law and grace. And you know, he even quote that statement about how you kind of leads to a kind of a conversionary experience with the Sermon on the Mount. He'd had this very Lutheran reading of the Sermon on the Mount. Instead, he saw that the sermon needs to be concrete. Disciples needs to be lived in the world. And it's not just something that, you know, it's about being saved. And again, Dallas Willard has helped me with this, right? And the gospel of sin management that he writes about in Divine Conspiracy and other places, right? That the gospel, that the kingdom of God is here now among us, and discipleship is engaging with that. It's not about having your Jesus card and getting to heaven free, right? So discipleship is placed in the world and following Jesus. So, but discipleship, I think, would help you with that question.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Dana.
Hi, my heart is so full. I'm so grateful for this wonderful presentation, as I love Bonhoeffer. And I talked a few times with you, Jeff. I'm Dr. Tonstad's friend, one of his friends. So we met. I asked you this question before. What would Bonhoeffer do today? But before that, I want to acknowledge Dr. deJesus' presentation and his approach in presenting Bonhoeffer, the fact that he believed and he lived his belief that we find Jesus within the oppressed communities. And I'm particularly drawn to this idea as a sociologist who worked with minorities back in Romania with Roma, Gypsy families, and as a chaplain today who works on hospice. And my contribution to the class, which is not a question, is a contribution, is that actually I believe this is what we do as a class. We are called Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School, and Roy Branson lived his belief. He sacrificed, he could have had an amazing career, and he sacrificed this amazing and comfortable career. He lived I don't know, I feel like using the word humble, but it's more than humble, is a scarce life, because he wanted to live for the truth. And in keeping in line with that, we continue to live a Christian life, to find Christ in our communities at work, to work for people in need at different levels. Each and every one of us is doing that. I discovered that every Sabbath, and I think it's so wonderful. And another thing that we can do as community, as a class, we moved, many of us, from theology to practice. And now, little by little, we are moving from practice back to theology, because I discover a new type of Adventist in this class. I don't know if I explained very clearly what I wanted to say, but I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart.
Thanks, Dana. Yeah, I know we appreciate that. And I agree, this is you all are blessed to have this class. I know it's been challenging to keep it going, and it's under all the circumstances you've been through. But I tell you, no, I know we talked about this before, Dana. We with one of the problems with Bonhoeffer is that we always end up with these questions about tyrannicide, and did Bonhoeffer was part of the plot to kill Hitler, and what would I do what would Bonhoeffer do, today, if he was an what would we, that whole thing. And this is one of my problems with, we kind of create these trolley car scenarios all the time, these ultimate scenarios that what would we do if we're in that scenario? Would I pull the trigger? Would I kill Hitler? Or if somebody was breaking into my house to kill my family and I had a gun, would I shoot and kill them? We create these ultimate scenarios. And I don't think that what Bonhoeffer's pushing back, and I could be wrong on this, but if I'm reading Bonhoeffer right, I think he's pushing back on that. And that God's word is not kind of an ethical program, but kind of a heuristic in a way that's kind of strips away our divergent self-referential hermeneutics to reveal kind of that we have to be totally throw ourselves completely into the mercy of God, and God, depend on God, and that we have to work through it as we go in faithfully following Jesus in discipleship. And that while yes, we can discuss this question, but ultimately on a day-to-day basis, in the moment by moment, that's where it really comes down to how I'm living my life. And I think for Bonhoeffer, a guide for that's the Sermon on the Mount. And not getting so caught up in these kind of ultimate what if scenarios. And I don't know. That's, yeah.
Thank you, because that's exactly the answer that I was looking for. I wasn't thinking that we should kill somebody that's in
Right.
power. I
Oh, I
was
know, yeah.
thinking, how would this a Bonhoeffer type of theology and type of life would change our daily life? And thank you for confirming that.
Yeah.
And thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Dana. It was fun.
Okay, thank you, Dana. Dave, I think that brings it back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jere. Thank you, Monty. And thank you, Bronwyn. Bronwyn may not be on the screen, but behind the scenes, she really helped us. She helped me get these technological problems solved, as did Monty. Both Monty and Bronwyn helped me get the technology right. So I'm particularly grateful for them, to them again. Now, 3 comments. One, I think the biggest book on ecclesiology written by an Adventist is one written by Reinder Brunsma. And we have not discussed it because I thought maybe it was too technical. But I think we should take another look at that possibility. Interestingly enough, he has a chapter called Social Justice. In a book on Adventist ecclesiology, there is a chapter called Social Justice. That's one thing. A second thing is that on the weekend of October 13 through 15, there will be a conference on remnant and Adventist identity. And I will send to you the links for this. I'm not sure where it's going to be held.
I think it's at Andrews University. I just learned about it and I was disappointed I hadn't heard about it sooner.
Okay, so it's Andrews University. I learned about it from Zach Plantak.
Yeah, that's who I learned about it from too.
Okay, now usually these conferences in the world before Zoom were limited to those who were there, but all of us can go to the conference at Andrews University the weekend of October 13th through 15th. Thirdly, as you know, we're thinking about going to the Centennial Complex and giving that another try, but we really need about 30 people who will pledge to be there at least twice a month to get us started. I think of these people as a kind of core constituency that will be there as things go up and down inevitably over the first year. We have had a little challenge by people saying, you really ought to go back to the Centennial Complex. And when we went back, they didn't show up. So that's a problem. We need people who will dedicate themselves to making this a success, because your comments are as important as what the speakers say on this occasion. So with those 3 things in mind, here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. It's good to see you all.
Okay, Dave, you might want to stop the recording.
Yes, I do. Let me see if I can do that. Boy, I don't see it.
I might be able to. Let me
There
try.
we go. I got it.